The rifle range at Fort Benning lay silent under the Georgia sun, the kind of silence that settles over concrete and steel when everyone else has gone to lunch. Dust motes hung in the air of the observation tower, turning golden in the light that slanted through the gaps in the corrugated metal roof. Captain Nadia Kovac sat alone on an ammunition crate, a disassembled M2010 ESR spread across an oil-stained cloth before her. Her hands moved with the practiced precision of someone who had performed this ritual 1,000 times, wiping each component with a microfiber cloth that had seen better days. The barrel gleamed under her attention. The bolt assembly clicked softly as she inspected the firing pin. No one paid attention to the woman in the faded Army combat uniform, her dark hair pulled back in a regulation bun, her face unremarkable except for the stillness in her gray eyes. She was invisible in the way that competent people often are when they don't seek attention, present but overlooked, capable but dismissed. What no one knew, what the thin manila folder locked in a safe at JSOC headquarters contained, was that Nadia Kovac held a record that existed only in classified after-action reports. Afghanistan, 2019. Operation Resolute Shield. A single shot fired from a ridge position that most snipers would have called impossible. The range finder had measured 2,940 meters. The wind had been gusting at 15 knots, shifting direction every 30 seconds. The temperature differential between the valley floor and the mountain ridge created thermal layers that bent light like water. The target had been a Taliban commander positioning a Dushka heavy machine gun that would have shredded an advancing platoon of Rangers. Nadia had calculated the variables in 40 seconds, compensated for Coriolis's effect, mirage, even the slight cant in her rifle due to the slope of the rocks beneath her. She had exhaled halfway, let her heartbeat slow to that place between seconds where the body becomes perfectly still, and pressed the trigger. The .300 Winchester Magnum round had traveled for 6 full seconds before impact. The commander had dropped, the machine gun had fallen silent, and 23 Rangers had lived to see another sunrise. But that achievement lived in shadow, known only to the 12 people with clearance to read the report. In the regular army, Nadia was just another marksmanship instructor, teaching basic rifle fundamentals to new recruits who barely knew which end of the weapon to hold. She had learned not to mention her deployments, not to correct the men who assumed she'd spent her combat tour behind a desk. Silence had become her armor, competence her quiet rebellion against expectations. The door to the range facility banged open, the sound sharp as a gunshot in the stillness. Nadia didn't look up, continuing her methodical cleaning. Footsteps echoed across the concrete floor multiple sets, the confident stride of men who owned whatever space they entered. They wore civilian clothes, but everything about them screamed special operations. The way they moved, the awareness in their scan of the room, the compact builds that spoke of functional strength rather than gym vanity. One of them carried himself with the particular bearing of a team leader, his eyes missing nothing as they swept across the range. Those eyes landed on Nadia, dismissed her in a fraction of a second, then continued their assessment. She was furniture, background, irrelevant. They were SEALs. She recognized the type even without the trident pins they wouldn't wear off base. Probably down from Virginia Beach for some kind of joint training exercise, using the Army's facilities because their own ranges were booked. The team leader, a man in his late 30s with sun-weathered skin and the quiet confidence of someone who'd seen things that lived in nightmares, walked to the range master's office. His teammates spread out, inspecting the shooting lanes, discussing wind flags and target distances in the shorthand of professionals. None of them looked at Nadia again. She reassembled the M2010 with smooth efficiency, each piece sliding into place with the satisfaction of perfect mechanical tolerances. The rifle was an extension of her body, as familiar as breathing. When she stood, slinging the weapon, one of the SEALs glanced over. He was younger than the others, maybe 28, with the kind of face that would have been handsome if not for the scar tissue around his left eye. He started to speak, probably to ask where the actual instructor was, but the team leader emerged from the office and the moment passed. "Range is cold until 1400, the team leader announced. His voice carried the flat authority of someone accustomed to instant obedience. "We've got it reserved for long-range work. Senior Chief wants everyone refreshed on fundamentals before we head overseas." Nadia nodded once, a minimal acknowledgement, and walked toward the exit. Behind her, she heard one of the SEALs mutter something about Army support staff, and another's low chuckle. The words rolled off her like rain off treated canvas. She had heard variations of that assumption for 6 years, ever since she'd left Special Operations Command for a regular assignment. The irony never got old, even if the sting had dulled to something more like distant amusement. Outside, the Georgia heat hit like a physical wall. The sky stretched overhead, cloudless and impossibly blue, the kind of sky that looked the same whether you were in Georgia or Afghanistan. Nadia walked to her truck, an ancient Ford Ranger that had survived 3 tour and more breakdowns than she could count, and stowed the M2010 in its hard case behind the seat. She had 2 hours before her next class, 2 hours to grab lunch and review the training schedule for the next batch of recruits arriving Monday. Her phone buzzed. A text from Major Chen, the battalion training officer. "Need you back at range ASAP. SEAL team requesting demonstration. Something about long-range capabilities." Nadia stared at the message for a long moment, then typed back, "On my way." She knew what this was. Some SEAL officer had looked at the range records, seen the distances they were set up for, and wanted to show his boys what real precision shooting looked like. They probably wanted to use it as a teaching moment, have some Army instructor walk them through the basics so they could demonstrate their superior skills. It was a familiar dance, one she'd participated in before. The SEALs would be professional about it, respectful even, but there would always be that underlying assumption that special operations began and ended with naval special warfare. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know because her service record had been sanitized for her current assignment, was that Nadia had spent 3 years attached to a classified unit that operated in the spaces between JSOC components. She had worked with Delta, with Rangers, with SEALs, even with agency paramilitary officers whose names appeared on no roster. She had learned from the best marksmen in the American military, absorbed their techniques, combined them with her own obsessive study of ballistics and meteorology. The 2,940-meter shot wasn't luck. It was the culmination of 10,000 hours of practice, of nights spent calculating trajectories until the mathematics became instinct. When she walked back into the range facility 15 minutes later, the SEALs had set up on Lane 7, the longest lane, which stretched out to 1,200 meters. They had brought their own rifles, a mix of MK-13s and SR-25s, precision weapons but not specialized for extreme long-range work. The team leader looked up as she approached, his expression neutral but assessing. "Captain Kovac," he asked, pronouncing her last name correctly, which suggested he'd actually read her nameplate rather than making assumptions. "I'm Commander Price. We're working on extended-range marksmanship. Major Chen said you might be able to assist." Nadia recognized the careful phrasing. Assist, not instruct. Help out, not teach. It was the language of courtesy masking doubt. "What distance are you shooting?" she asked, her voice quiet, almost neutral. "We'll start at 800, work out to 1,200 if the wind cooperates." Price gestured to the targets downrange. "My boys are solid at 600, but we're deploying to terrain where we might need to reach out further." 1,200's a good training distance, Nadia said. She set her rifle case down, didn't open it. "What's your wind call right now?" One of the SEALs, the younger one with the scar, stepped forward. "I've got right to left at maybe 5 knots, gusting to 8. Nadia looked downrange, watching the flags, the mirage rising from the sun-heated earth, the way the heat shimmer bent the air. 7 knots steady at ground level, but you've got a thermal layer at about 15 feet that's moving left to right at 9. They'll cancel partially in the middle, but at 1200 you'll need to compensate for the upper layer more. And there's a pressure system moving in from the west. Give it 20 minutes and that wind will shift. The SEALs exchanged glances. Price's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Interest, maybe, or skepticism that someone was contradicting his operator's assessment. "You shoot much long range, Captain?" he asked. "Some," Nadia said. She knelt, opened her rifle case, and lifted out the M2010. The weapon gleamed in the fluorescent lights, every surface perfectly maintained. She had replaced the standard stock with a custom Macmillan, added a Nightforce ATACR scope, tuned the trigger pull to exactly 2.5 pounds. It was a weapon built for one purpose: reaching targets that other rifles couldn't touch. Price watched as she set up, laying out her shooting mat, positioning her data book, setting her Kestrel weather meter on a small tripod. Professional, methodical. No wasted movement. His interest sharpened. "Where'd you deploy?" he asked, the question casual but the attention behind it focused. "Afghanistan mostly. Some other places." Nadia didn't elaborate. The places without names, the operations that existed only in classified databases, those weren't for casual conversation. She settled into position behind the rifle, her body finding the familiar angles, the stock coming to her shoulder like it had grown there. "What are you set up for?" one of the other SEALs asked. He was older, probably the senior enlisted, with gray at his temples and the lean build of a marathoner. Nadia looked through her scope, ranging targets. "Depends what you need demonstrated." Price crouched beside her, his movements economical. Up close, she could see the intelligence in his eyes, the careful way he evaluated new information. "Chen said you had something to show us, something about distance work." "There's a target at 2,800 meters, Nadia said quietly. "On the ridgeline past the main berm. We set it up for experimental shooting. Most people don't see it." The SEALs looked downrange. Even with optics, the target was barely visible, a speck of tan against brown earth. Price pulled out a range finder, confirmed the distance, then looked back at Nadia with new attention. "That's almost 2 miles. 2,834 meters exactly," Nadia said. She was checking her data book, reviewing the ballistic tables she'd memorized years ago. "Wind's tricky at that distance. You've got to account for the bullet dropping below subsonic, the way the stability changes." "That's an impossible shot," the young SEAL said, not rudely, just stating what he believed to be fact. "Even in perfect conditions." Nadia didn't argue. She'd learned years ago that some things couldn't be explained, only demonstrated. She checked her Kestrel again, noted the temperature, humidity, barometric pressure. The wind was doing exactly what she'd predicted, beginning its shift. In 15 minutes it would be perfect. She settled into her shooting position, getting comfortable, letting her breathing slow. The SEALs watched with the polite attention of professionals humoring a colleague, expecting competence at normal ranges, not believing for a second that she'd attempt what she was suggesting. "The shot I took in Afghanistan was 2,940 meters, Nadia said quietly, not bragging, just stating fact. "The wind was worse. The target was moving, but I had to take it because if I didn't, good men would have died." Price's expression changed. The polite interest became something sharper, more focused. "Wait," he said slowly. "Kavak, Operation Resolute Shield, your widow." The nickname hit like a slap, even after all these years. Widow. Black Widow. The call sign that had followed her through 3 deployments, earned not because of her appearance or demeanor but because of what she did to targets at impossible distances. They never saw her coming, never knew what hit them, just dropped like flies in a web they couldn't perceive. The other SEAL's attention snapped to her, their casual observation transforming into the intense focus of operators recognizing one of their own. "Holy shit," the senior enlisted breathed. "You're the sniper from the valley. The one who saved that Ranger platoon. Nadia's jaw tightened. She didn't like talking about it, didn't like the way the story had grown in the telling, becoming legend rather than simply a desperate shot taken in a desperate moment. "I did my job," she said simply. "Your job was a shot that even our best guys said was impossible." Price settled onto the concrete beside her. His entire demeanor changed. This wasn't a superior officer humoring a subordinate anymore. This was a professional recognizing expertise that exceeded his own. "I read the classified report. The analyst said the probability of success was less than 15% even with perfect conditions." "The analysts weren't on that ridge," Nadia said. She was watching the wind flags, the mirage, the way the light played across the distant target. The math was running in her head, automatic as breathing. Muzzle velocity, ballistic coefficient, spin drift, Coriolis effect. The bullet would drop over 200 feet during its flight, arc through the air like a thrown stone, slow from supersonic to subsonic, become unstable if she miscalculated even slightly. And they didn't have Rangers dying if they got the math wrong. "Show us," Price said. It wasn't an order, wasn't a challenge. It was a request from one professional to another, a recognition of skill that demanded to be witnessed. Nadia looked through her scope, watching the target shimmer in the heat. The wind was settling, the thermal layers stabilizing. She had maybe a 5-minute window before conditions changed again. Her finger found the trigger, familiar as an old friend. "Magazine," she said quietly. The senior SEAL handed her a loaded magazine without question. She inserted it, chambered a round, and settled deeper into her position. The rifle became part of her, an extension of intent translated into steel and physics. She could feel everything, the concrete beneath her, the slight breeze on her face, the way her heartbeat pulsed through her body. All of it had to be accounted for, compensated for, mastered. Wind right to left, 9 knots at shooter position, 11 knots at mid-range, 7 knots at target, she murmured, speaking more to herself than her audience. Temperature 78 degrees, dropping to 72 at ridge altitude. Humidity 42%. Barometric pressure 30.12 and falling. The SEALs were silent, watching a master at work. This wasn't bravado or showmanship. This was someone performing calculations that most marksmen would need a computer for, doing it in her head with the speed of long practice. "Spin drift will push it 8 inches right," Nadia continued. "Coriolis another 4. Bullet drops 216 feet, time of flight 7.2 seconds. I'm holding 46 milliradians elevation, 12 mils left for wind." She made the adjustments to her scope, each click precise. "The target's a 12-inch plate. I'll hit center mass." "Captain," Price said quietly, and there was something like awe in his voice now. "You don't have to prove anything." "I'm not proving anything," Nadia said. She exhaled slowly, finding that space between heartbeats where the world became perfectly still. "I'm just taking the shot." The trigger broke clean. The rifle roared, recoiling into her shoulder with familiar force. The muzzle blast kicked up dust from the concrete. Through the scope, even with the recoil, Nadia tracked the bullet's path by watching the mirage distortion. 7.2 seconds is an eternity when you're watching. The SEALs were frozen, holding their breath, watching through spotting scopes and range finders. The distant clang of metal on metal carried back across the range, faint but unmistakable. "Impact center mass," the senior SEAL said, his voice tight with disbelief. "Holy Mother of God, she actually hit it." Nadia cycled the bolt, chambering another round. "The wind's going to shift in 3 minutes," she said calmly. "After that, the shot gets harder. Want me to show you the correction for changing conditions?" Price was staring at her like he'd never seen her before, and in a way he hadn't. 10 minutes ago she'd been furniture, background noise, an army officer there to assist. Now she was something else entirely, a reminder that expertise doesn't announce itself, doesn't demand recognition, simply exists and waits to be discovered. "How many times have you made that shot?" he asked. "At this range, maybe 50 times. In combat, Nadia paused, remembering ridges and valleys, remembered desperate situations where mathematics became the difference between life and death. Twice. Once in Afghanistan, once in a place I can't talk about. Both times people lived because the shot landed. The young SEAL who'd called it impossible was shaking his head slowly, a grin spreading across his scarred face. "I've been shooting for 8 years," he said, "trained with the best instructors in naval special warfare, and I just watched someone do something I didn't think was physically possible." "It's possible," Nadia said simply. "It just takes practice, and understanding that the rifle, the bullet, the wind they're all part of a system. You don't fight the system, you work with it." Price stood, looked at his team, then back at Nadia. "Captain, we're here for 2 weeks of training. Our senior chief wanted us to get better at long-range work. Would you be willing to? I mean, if your schedule allows." "You want instruction," Nadia said, and there was the faintest hint of amusement in her voice now. "I want to learn from someone who's better than me," Price said bluntly, "and I haven't met many people who I can say that about." Nadia considered. She thought about the recruits she taught, the basic marksmanship classes, the repetitive drills that any competent sergeant could run. She thought about what it meant to work with operators who would actually listen, who understood that skill wasn't about rank or gender or branch of service, just about results. "I can do afternoons," she said. 1300 to 1700. We'll start with fundamentals, make sure your basics are solid. Then we'll work distance." "Fundamentals," the senior SEAL repeated, and there might have been a hint of protest in his voice. These were Tier 1 operators after all. They knew the fundamentals. Nadia looked at him steadily. "When's the last time someone checked your natural point of aim, your breathing cycle, the way you're gripping the stock?" She paused. "Fundamentals aren't basic. They're fundamental. There's a difference." Price nodded slowly. "She's right, Hicks. We'll do it her way." He extended his hand to Nadia. "Thank you, Captain, for the demonstration and for agreeing to work with us." Nadia shook his hand, surprised by the genuine respect in his grip. "Call me Kavak," she said, "and we start tomorrow. Bring your rifles, your data books, and whatever you think you know about wind. We're going to rebuild your understanding from the ground up." As the SEALs packed their gear and headed out, discussing what they'd just witnessed in voices that mixed excitement with disbelief, Price lingered. "Can I ask you something?" he said quietly. "Depends on the question." "Why are you here, teaching basics to recruits? With your skills, you should be at SOTIC training snipers, or attached to a special mission unit." Nadia was quiet for a long moment, running her hand along the M2010 stock. "I did that," she said finally. "Spent 3 years in places that don't exist, doing things I can't talk about. Got very good at putting bullets in targets at distances that most people consider mythical. And then one day I realized I was becoming something I didn't want to be. Someone who only existed in shadows, whose entire identity was wrapped up in being invisible until the moment I pulled a trigger. So you walked away." "I chose something different. I teach recruits because most of them will never fire a shot in combat, and that's a good thing. But if they do, I want them to have the best foundation I can give them. And I stay sharp on my own time on ranges like this because the skills matter. They might matter again someday." Price nodded slowly. "That Afghan shot, the one that saved the Rangers, did you know them, the men you saved?" "Never met them," Nadia said. "Never even knew their names until I read the citation later. They were just people who needed to live, and I was someone who could make that happen. That's the job, isn't it? Not glory, not recognition. Just doing what needs to be done when it needs doing." "That's the job," Price agreed. He looked at her with something that might have been understanding. "See you tomorrow at 1300, Kavak, and thank you, not just for the training, for the reminder that competence doesn't announce itself." After he left, Nadia stood alone on the range again, the familiar silence settling back over the concrete and steel. She field-stripped the M2010, cleaning it with the same meticulous care she'd shown before the SEALs arrived. The rifle had performed perfectly, as it always did. The shot had landed where the mathematics said it would land, because physics didn't care about gender or expectations or assumptions. Physics just was, clean and absolute and fair in a way that human judgment rarely managed. She thought about tomorrow, about teaching men who had probably started the day assuming they had nothing to learn from an army captain running basic marksmanship classes. She thought about the look in Price's eyes when he'd recognized her call sign, the way the entire dynamic had shifted in the space between heartbeats. It was always like that, the sudden recalibration when people realized that their assumptions had been wrong. Sometimes it was satisfying. Mostly it was just tiring. But there was something else too, something she hadn't felt in a while. Anticipation. The SEALs were professionals who would listen, who would absorb, who understood that expertise earned respect regardless of its packaging. Working with them wouldn't be like teaching recruits who barely knew which end of the rifle to point down range. It would be a dialogue, an exchange, the kind of teaching that sharpened the instructor as much as the student. Nadia packed her gear, locked the rifle case, and headed for her truck. The Georgia sky was beginning to soften toward evening, the harsh afternoon light mellowing into something gentler. Tomorrow she'd be back here, breaking down the science of long-range shooting into digestible pieces, watching as Tier 1 operators rebuilt their understanding of ballistics and wind reading. Some of them would resist at first, their egos bruised by having to revisit fundamentals. Others would embrace it, recognizing the opportunity to learn from someone whose skills exceeded their own. And maybe, just maybe, some of them would understand what she'd learned over years of practice and combat, that being underestimated wasn't weakness. It was armor. It let you move through the world with your capabilities hidden until the moment they were needed, let you avoid the weight of expectations and assumptions that came with being known. Nadia had learned to be invisible not because she lacked confidence, but because invisibility was power. It let her choose when to reveal herself, when to demonstrate that the quiet woman cleaning a rifle in the corner was someone who could reach out and touch targets at distances that defied belief. The M2010 rode in its case behind her seat as she drove back to her quarters, the familiar weight of it a comfort. Tomorrow would be interesting. The SEALs would arrive expecting a lesson. What they'd get was an education. And Nadia Kovac, called widow by those who knew what she could do, would teach them that distance wasn't just about meters and trajectories. It was about patience, precision, and the understanding that the most dangerous shots came from directions you never saw coming, fired by people you never thought to watch for. The sun set over Fort Benning, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, and Nadia Kovac smiled quietly to herself, already planning tomorrow's curriculum in her mind. She would start with breathing, she decided. Not because the SEALs didn't know how to breathe, but because they'd forgotten how to breathe in the way that made impossible shots possible. She'd teach them to find that space between heartbeats, that moment of perfect stillness where the body became a stable platform and the mind became pure mathematics. Some of them would get it immediately. Others would struggle, fighting against years of ingrained habits. But by the time she was done with them, every single SEAL would be a better marksman than when they started. And that, Nadia thought as she parked her truck and carried her gear inside, was what really mattered. Not the recognition, not the moment of shock when people realized what she could do. Just the quiet satisfaction of passing on skills that might save lives someday, in some valley or ridge or desperate moment when mathematics became the difference between going home and being carried home. That was why she did this. That was why she stayed, teaching and practicing and maintaining skills that most people didn't know she had. Because someday, somewhere, someone would need a shot made at impossible distance. And whether it was her or someone she'd trained, that shot would land. The target would drop, and people would live who might otherwise have died. That was the job. Not glory, not recognition. Just doing what needed to be done when it needed doing, with the quiet competence that came from 10,000 hours of practice and a refusal to accept that impossible meant anything more than difficult. Nadia cleaned her rifle one more time before bed, the ritual as much meditation as maintenance. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new students, new opportunities to prove that expertise didn't announce itself. It simply existed, waiting to be discovered by those who had eyes to see and humility to learn. And in the morning, when 1300 hours rolled around and the SEALs assembled on the range, they would find not an instructor but a master craftsman, ready to share secrets that couldn't be found in any manual or learned in any school. They would find Widow, though she'd never used that call sign herself, and they would learn what it meant to reach out across impossible distances and touch the untouchable. The night settled over Fort Benning, quiet and vast, and somewhere in the darkness, Nadia Kovac slept the dreamless sleep of someone who knew exactly who they were and what they were capable of, regardless of what anyone else assumed. Tomorrow would take care of itself. It always did. The morning arrived cool and clear, the kind of Georgia dawn that promised heat later but started with comfortable temperatures. Nadia was on the range by 1100, setting up lanes, positioning targets at various distances, preparing the lesson plan in her head. She'd brought her personal M2010, plus the unit's teaching rifles, an assortment of ammunition types for demonstration purposes, and her collection of weather meters and ballistic calculators. Some instructors relied heavily on technology, letting computers do the thinking. Nadia believed in understanding the underlying principles, being able to calculate solutions in your head when the electronics failed or the situation demanded speed over precision tools. The SEALs arrived at 12:45, early and professional. Price led them, carrying a hard case that Nadia recognized as containing a Mk13 Mod 7. The others had similar cases, along with range bags stuffed with ammunition, data books, and the accumulated gear of serious marksmen. They'd clearly taken her requirements seriously, bringing everything they might need for intensive training. "Captain," Price greeted her, that new respect evident in his tone and posture. Not deference. SEALs didn't really do deference, but the acknowledgement between professionals who recognized competence. "Where do you want us?" "Lanes 2 through 8, Nadia said. "Set up your rifles, get comfortable. We're starting at 300 meters, and I know that seems basic, but trust the process." There were a few exchanged glances. The kind that said 300 meters was insultingly short for operators who regularly engaged targets at 600 and beyond. But they set up without complaint, laying out shooting mats, positioning rifles, settling into prone positions with the practiced efficiency of men who'd done this thousands of times. Nadia walked the line, observing. She watched how they held their rifles, how they positioned their bodies, where their support hands gripped the stocks. Each man had developed his own style over years of shooting, small variations that had become habit. Some of those habits were good. Others were limiting them in ways they didn't realize. "Hicks," she said, stopping beside the senior enlisted who'd questioned the need for fundamentals. "Your support hand is too far forward. You're muscling the rifle, trying to control recoil that hasn't happened yet. Slide it back 6 inches, relax your grip. The rifle should rest in your hand, not be strangled by it." Hicks adjusted, and Nadia watched his whole position change, becoming more natural, more stable. "Better," she said. "Now you're breathing. You're holding between heartbeats, but you're tense doing it. The pause should be natural, not forced." She moved down the line, making small corrections. A slight adjustment to foot position here, a reminder about natural point of aim there. Nothing dramatic, nothing that suggested their fundamentals were terrible. Just refinements, the difference between good and exceptional. The SEALs absorbed the corrections without ego, each adjustment met with focused attention and immediate implementation. The fundamentals matter because at distance, small errors become catastrophic, Nadia explained, addressing the group as they settled into their corrected positions. At 300 meters, a slight cant in your rifle might cost you an inch. At 1500 meters, that same error puts you 3 feet off target. We're going to rebuild your muscle memory so these positions become automatic, so you can set up in the dark under stress, exhausted, and still have a stable platform. How long did it take you? Asked the young SEAL with the scarred face. His name was Martinez, she'd learned. To get to where that 2,800-meter shot was routine. It's never routine, Nadia said quietly. Every shot at that distance is a negotiation with physics, probability, and luck. But to answer your question, 5 years of dedicated practice before I trusted myself at extreme range. 3 years of combat experience before I'd take that shot with lives on the line. And I still practice every week, because skills degrade faster than you think. She let them shoot, observing their groups, their consistency, the way they call their shots. At 300 meters, all of them were competent, groupings tight, fundamentals solid. But she could see the places where they'd hit their limits at longer ranges. A slight flinch in anticipation of recoil. Inconsistent cheek weld. Breathing patterns that varied shot to shot. These were the things that separated good from exceptional, that determined whether you could reach out to 1,800 meters or stop at 12. The rifle is a precision instrument, Nadia said during a reload break. But it's only as precise as the platform it's fired from. Your body is that platform. Every inconsistency in your position, every variation in your process translates directly to the target. At long range, you're not just shooting a rifle. You're becoming part of a system, body, weapon, ammunition, environment, all working together. Break any link in that system and the whole thing fails. They moved to 500 meters after an hour, and Nadia increased the difficulty. Wind flags are off, she announced.